"There's someone in my driveway, and I don't recognize them." Those are the last words Florida law professor Dan Markel ever spoke. What happened next would take nearly a decade to unravel and expose a family's deadly secret. On July 18, 2014, Florida State law professor Dan Markel was on the phone as he pulled into his Tallahassee driveway. He noticed someone behind him and said, "There's someone in my driveway, and I don't recognize them." Those were his final words. The line went dead. A neighbor heard gunshots and saw a metallic Prius speeding away. He found Markel bleeding inside his car and called 911. Markel was rushed to the hospital but died 14 hours later. What appeared to be a random robbery quickly revealed itself as something far more calculated. A murder-for-hire conspiracy that would take years to fully unravel. Dan Markel was born in Toronto in 1972 to a close Jewish family. His intellectual drive propelled him to Harvard for undergraduate and law school. He earned a master's from Cambridge and clerked for a federal judge before joining Florida State University's law faculty in 2005. He was prolific, co-founding Prof's Blog, a respected legal blog. He married Wendy Adelson in 2006 after meeting on JDate, and they had 2 sons. But Wendy never adjusted to Tallahassee life, missing her family in South Florida. The marriage began to fracture beneath the surface of academic success. In September 2012, while Dan traveled for work, Wendy packed the marital home and left with their 2 sons and most of the furniture. She left divorce papers on the bed. Dan returned to an empty house and described the experience as his Pearl Harbor. He did not know where his sons were for weeks. Eventually, he learned Winnie had taken them to her parents' home in Coral Springs. She filed for divorce and wanted to remain in South Florida. Dan fought through the courts to keep his sons in Tallahassee. The custody battle became the central conflict of their lives. The Adelson family saw Dan Markel as an obstacle. They offered him money to surrender custody, but he refused. He had begun a new relationship and was rebuilding his life. Meanwhile, Wendy's brother Charlie, a periodontist, began discussing the situation with Catherine Magbanua. Magbanua was connected to Sigfrido Garcia, a man with gang ties. The motive was geography. The Adelsons wanted Wendy and her sons 500 miles closer to Coral Springs. Dan's legal standing in Tallahassee made that impossible. The family decided to eliminate the obstacle permanently. Garcia recruited his friend Luis Rivera, a member of the Latin Kings Network. In June 2014, they made a reconnaissance trip to Tallahassee in a rented Toyota Prius. They familiarized themselves with the neighborhood and stayed in motels. They returned to South Florida without acting. 6 weeks later, they came back. On July 16th and 17th, Garcia, Rivera, and Magbanua checked into motels again. Donna Adelson had signed 44 checks to Magbanua with no documented work performed. The payments continued until April 2016. On July 18th, Dan dropped his sons at daycare and went to the gym. A green Prius followed him from the gym to his home. As he pulled into his driveway, still on the phone, he noticed someone approaching. The call ended with a grunt and labored breathing. Neighbors heard gunshots. The Prius sped away. Markel had been shot twice, in the forehead and left cheek. He never regained consciousness and died the next morning. Garcia called Magbanua within 90 minutes. That evening, she visited Charlie's house to collect payment. The money was damp and moldy. Tallahassee police had few leads. No valuables were taken. No obvious enemy surfaced. But the Prius had a SunPass transponder, rare in Tallahassee but common in South Florida. Investigators traced it to a Miami rental lot. The car was rented to Garcia and Rivera. Surveillance footage placed Garcia at an ATM in the Prius. Witnesses linked the men to the motel stays and to a revolver matching the shooting. By April 2016, investigators knew who was involved, but needed the Adelsons to talk. They sent an undercover FBI agent to approach Donna. Donna called Charlie immediately after the FBI encounter. The following day, Charlie met Magbanua at Dolce Vita restaurant, where a recording device captured their conversation. The Adelsons used a code word for the murder, the TV, and discussed it openly on monitored phone lines. This language exposed their knowledge of the crime. In May and June 2016, Garcia and Rivera were arrested. Rivera accepted a plea deal for 19 years and testified. Magbanua was arrested in October 2016. Garcia was convicted in 2019 and sentenced to life. Magbanua was convicted in 2022. Charlie Adelson was indicted in April 2022, nearly 8 years after the murder. At his trial, prosecutors presented phone records, enhanced audio from Dolce Vita, and Magbanua's testimony. She described how Charlie would step away to call his mother when discussing the scheme. The jury heard Charlie say on tape, "If you're going to charge me, charge me." On November 6, 2023, he was convicted and received life without parole plus 60 years. Days later, Donna was arrested at Miami International Airport with a one-way ticket to Vietnam. The Dan Markel case spanned nearly a decade and 5 trials. It exposed how a wealthy family used money and intermediaries to eliminate a father who stood in the way of their custody preferences. The murder was planned over 9 months, financed through a dental practice, and executed by hired men. The SunPass transponder, the Prius, and the phone records dismantled the conspiracy. Dan Markel was 41 years old, a devoted father and respected scholar. His sons grew up without him. Justice arrived late, but it arrived for every participant.